to start by introducing you and get a quick introduction. I think I'll share, my first impression of you. I think we started following each other maybe 6 months ago or so, and I saw this other person that was posting about censorship resistance, and I was like, fuck yeah, it's another person that's like actually thinking about this and cares about the mission of crypto. And like even in a bear market, these people are rare. And so I was instantly like, oh, okay, finally, like a friend, someone that is like pursuing the like ultimate end of crypto, which is to provide, in my opinion, financial privacy and independence, sovereignty to people, whoever they are, and regardless of what their background is, without discriminating. So was really excited to see that, and I'm excited to talk with you today about all of the things that are going on in crypto, particularly news, narratives, and your views on things, and to try to understand more about you. So would love an introduction if you want to open it up from there.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Thank you for that. And I agree. I sort of followed you for the same reasons. I thought like there aren't. You're right. Even in a bear market, there's just when there's not a lot of noise, there's still not a lot of talk about certain like founding principles of crypto. But I feel like for the most part, I feel like the industry is improving. I might be very critical at times, but I feel like it's getting better, right? And I think there some people might want to dispute that. They might have different opinions, but I feel like overall, like the direction, like I like the direction we're going, at least so far. But yeah, some more on my background. I kind of got into crypto like like okay. So when I first found out about Bitcoin, was basically the first ever um, crypto cycle, like the first major one, right? So that was when I heard about Bitcoin. So I was basically like the first sort of retail crowd that I found out about Bitcoin at the top. Like when I first heard about Bitcoin, it was already after Silk Road had already happened and everything. So I would consider anyone who had maybe transacted with Bitcoin or mined Bitcoin or anything before 2013 or whatever, or before the whole Silk Road got shut down and all that. I would say they're like the OGs, Bitcoin OGs. And then anyone after that, I'd say is like a crypto OG. But like from that time, I think that was like the first time that Bitcoin really came on the map. Right before that, nobody knew what it was. The only people that knew were like tech nerds, like the really cypherpunk people, people that were into cryptography, or like people that were into distributed systems, or they were just really plugged into like the tech scene. And after Silk Road, it basically made headwinds everywhere. So people started to hear about it. It made the news or whatever, and it was like there was a lot of chatter about it even before it started getting big on the news. And I guess that's when I first discovered it. And so when I kind of first dug into it, I didn't like. I understood it right away, but I wasn't nearly like I didn't have a strong enough understanding of like the technicals, like of like computer science for one. And then the other thing I didn't have a good understanding at all was anything related to finance or like economics or like monetary policy or anything like that, right? Like I didn't even know like how money like functions or anything. So I didn't have any of the tools to recognize like how serious this was, even though I really appreciated it at the time. So when I first found out about Bitcoin, I spent some time looking into it, and there's a few things that stuck out to me as limitations that issues I had with Bitcoin, and one of the main ones was another a big issue at the time of the barrier was that there weren't even mobile apps at that time. So like there was no mobile wallet to hold Bitcoin, right? Like, sorry, there were mobile apps, but there were no like mobile Bitcoin apps or wallets, right? So there's no way to even like just mobilely carry Bitcoin with you. They were all desktop wallets at the time, and there was like and they were all really like primitive wallets, and there were like these really like shady exchanges to purchase Bitcoin from. And like at the time, it was like you're worried like to give your credit card to any of these, and most of them didn't even accept credit cards for like anything more than like $100. And so anyway, it was just like there was all these limitations. So like there was like these tech limitations of what was available at the time, and then also like I didn't understand it well enough. And then the other thing that I found like a big constraint of Bitcoin was that you couldn't transact it trustlessly. So it was trustless; you can send it trustlessly, but like you can't like actually transact with it trustlessly. So like you have to have like some agreement off chain, right? And at the time, I didn't know what that meant, right? I just recognized that like this is like a constraint. I didn't know that like it could be solved with like smart contracts, moving the agreement on chain pretty much. And I feel like I obviously didn't even see like that there's a whole design space there or anything like that. So I sort of like I dove into it a bit. I understood. I even like bought some Bitcoin. I remember it was a big hassle to buy it, and I think I ended up selling it like later for a loss or whatever. And like so I just kind of left the Bitcoin crypto scene at the time, and there was really no trading anything you could do at the time. So like even if you were like interested in want to speculate, like you could just buy Bitcoin, or that's it. There were like Litecoin and there was like XRP, and that was it. And like and it didn't look that appealing either, even at that time. I remember XRP looked like a scam even back then to me. So like I it wasn't really much I could do. So I just left the scene for like a long time. I didn't really get back into crypto until 2020, like early 2020, and or like spring of 2020, and I didn't even know what Ethereum was. Like I never heard of the word Ethereum. I never heard of any other chain but Bitcoin and then Litecoin and then XRP. And so like when I sort of look back into like crypto or like Bitcoin mainly, I just saw all these other tokens and projects and all this other stuff. Like this is, and I just looked at the Coin Gecko list, right? Like I was like, wow, like what is all this? So I just started diving into it, and like immediately it took me like a week from like the time I rediscovered crypto to for me to become ETH maxi. So like I just became an ETH maxi like really quickly, just like right away understood it, and like now this time is the difference is that like I'm a little more mature. I understand a little more about finance. I understand a little bit more about money and like and a lot of just like stuff that context I didn't have earlier when I was younger. And so like for me it made so much sense. And like I guess it was also I was sort of lucky because at the time there's this huge buildup of activity in DeFi that no one noticed was happening. And like DeFi was like the next frontier of like blockchain like use cases really. And like I know like I missed the whole like 2017 cycle, but I know like a lot of narratives of that cycle were like putting things on the blockchain and stuff like that, and things that didn't really gain any traction. But like the first real PMF of like a smart contract chain was DeFi, and like nobody knew about that. And I guess I just had this opportunity to like realize this before it really made headlines and stuff and sort of landed on everyone's radar. And I guess it was just like a good opportunity, and I sort of got it right away. And there was the one thing, another advantage was that there was really open ecosystem and community in the synthetics community that's basically would like harbor anyone that would want to come and sort of like was curious of DeFi. Most other places, like you're not going to get any hands-on like any sort of hands-on interaction with anyone in DeFi, like in the early days, outside of like the synthetics Discord and like on crypto Twitter, right? Like most of the other Discords were pretty much like just like for tech support, and like there was no one really hanging out in them or anything like that. But like synthetics had that sort of hangout sort of community where a lot of people were just like very curious. Everyone was in it for like have been in like crypto for a while. Everyone was in crypto for the tech, and so it was just like it was sort of like a perfect storm of a place to like learn and to grow. And so I basically started contributing to synthetics from as early as 2020, and then over time, as I like began to understand more about DeFi and like about crypto in general, and meanwhile I'm like degenning it out on chain, right? Like running my non-sub, doing interacting with like basically every DeFi protocol. And anyway, yeah. So like, long story short, I started contributing to synthetics in 2020. I've been contributing to the protocol since 2021, and I've been part of their governance since then as well. And right now, I serve a role on the Spartan Council, where it was a form of delegated governance where you're elected to sort of handle protocol, vote on protocol upgradability and protocol changes, which are like essentially synthetics improvement proposals, um, and parameter changes and stuff like that. So yeah, that's basically the story. Sorry for like the long rant there. I just realized I went on for a while.
That's cool. That's awesome. It's funny how like you can tell what year someone got in by their like their ideological beliefs and what they believe crypto is good for. So you have like 2009 to 2011 were like hardcore cypherpunks already, and then 2011 to 2012 were like the IT guys that are kind of like lurking in the background at their companies doing the like networking and network engineering kind of people. And then 2013 and 2014 were the libertarians and the people that like understand Bitcoin's implications politically. 2015 there was like almost nobody that came in, but I'd kind of those are kind of like a wild card in my experience. Same with 2016, and then 2017 were like all the people that came in like truly for the tech, because they were like, oh cool, we can do like interesting things here. And some of those like have started to lean politically into the cypherpunk narrative. But and then you got like 2018, there's almost no one that stuck around from 2018. uh, 2019, same kind of thing, like kind of like the laggards, I think, of the libertarian crowd, or the the crypto anarchists. And then 2020, yeah, like DeFi popped off. So 2020 was like the DeFi degens, and then 2021 was the NFT bros, and then 2022, I don't really know. I think it's too early to tell, but it's cool to hear that you got in around 2014, it sounds like, maybe just early 2014 at the top of that first real cycle. So you've basically maybe not been there the whole time, but you've seen this will be your third market cycle.
I wouldn't say my third market cycle because I was completely out of the loop for like I missed all of like the whole Monero launch, ETH white paper. Like I was completely clueless to that. Even though the ETH white paper happened like before I sort of when I first started learning about Bitcoin, but it just like I to me it was like I bought the Bitcoin once and I tried like and I was just like tried like tracking it, trying to understand it. And one other thing that's really interesting, and maybe we could talk about this later when we talk about Bitcoin tokenomics or something, is that even back then, when Bitcoin made its huge run up, I remember like I had a friend that was mining Bitcoin and it wasn't that lucrative. So like I don't know like if anyone thinks Bitcoin was ever mining was ever super lucrative. At the time, like most of the time it wasn't. It was like the miners who mined their Bitcoin, if they held it, later on they end up realizing a ton of gain. But at the time while they're spending that electricity, it's not that lucrative, and it's never really been. And I remember when the one main theme was like 2013 was that like mining was already not that profitable. Like the average home miner couldn't do it anymore. Like there were already these huge mining farms popping up in 2013. It was getting industrialized because like the price had just gone from like $10 to like $1,000. And so there's all this hype and all this attention. Like mining wasn't profitable. So like for me to participate, there was just not much for me to do. I couldn't really like mining at home was starting to be phased out. Even though in retrospect, like obviously it would have been smart to do it, but like at the time, like the consensus was that like it's getting overly competitive, and so it's not really that lucrative. And there isn't much trading to do. Like there's no like centralized exchanges you couldn't trust them. Mount Gox, I like right around the time when I was learning about it, like Magic, the online gathering exchange went like had the whole issue, right? And I guess you can call it insolvency or a hack or whatever, but it basically started to crumble. And then so like there was nothing like really for anyone like me that's not like tech savvy or doesn't fully understand the tech stack to do at the time. And so like I kind of left it. But I kind of wish I stuck around and because I feel like that phase was a huge, huge, huge moment of like where a lot of stuff was born. Like you had ETH born, you had Monero born. And like this is pretty like interesting. Like when you look at like even Zcash and Monero, like these were like two blockchains that didn't exist when I first started when I first found out about Bitcoin. And when I came back, they had already been like through a whole cycle. They've like fully matured. They had a whole community and everything. So like it was actually honestly really impressive. I feel like that time was like a really important moment in crypto, like that phase of like 2014 to 2016. So yeah, like, but I definitely wouldn't say I was part of that cycle. And interestingly, I didn't even hear about like the 2018 cycle. Like, didn't make any news. Like, didn't break through on any of my radars. Like, I didn't even hear about it. Obviously, like, I don't think there's anyone that didn't hear about crypto in the 2021 cycle. Like, because it was on like every sports channel, like on the Super Bowl, there was a bunch of ads. I feel like there's no way you could have avoided that cycle, but yeah, I didn't even notice like the 2018 cycle before that.
Yeah, 2018 and like the 2017 run up, I think, got good amount of attention in like the latter part of the year. So November and December were just frenzied. But that's yeah, I can imagine maybe possible to stay insulated from it. Um, yeah, that I sort of I was less involved in 2015, 2016. Involved enough that I panic sold ETH at $8, but not involved enough to realize like what Ethereum was becoming. I toyed around with it and stuff, but I was like, oh shit, it's crashing. It's probably done because this is this new experimental thing, and I didn't understand the nuances of what the DAO was and stuff. But so yeah, that was a whole era. But I think through that, like there was, yeah, Monero and Zcash got launched, but Zcash was a giant rug. Like it was trading at parity with Bitcoin. I think it ICO'd at one. No, it didn't ICO. It started at around 1 Bitcoin on Binance or whichever exchanges it was trading on at the time. Again, I wasn't attuned to Zcash or Monero until 2017. Um, but yeah, lots
I
of
mean, I
interesting
think,
stuff.
sorry to interrupt you. I think the main reason I just brought up Zcash and Monero is because like it's sort of like the first application of zero knowledge proof, like zero knowledge proofs to the chain for Zcash, and then with Monero, it's like this novel consensus meets encryption, and meets like their whole way of um, I, I forget what they call that, stealth balances or whatever, or is that Zcash? Like, but
There's a
anyway,
lot.
like
Yeah.
this is like the first time like this stuff is being applied. So that's why I sort of and like with ETH, this first time smart contracts being applied. So that's why I sort of like mentioned those three or whatever. But like there was just a bunch of other things, and I kind of agree. I don't think Zcash sort of panned out the way a lot of people wanted it to. But yeah,
Well,
that's just the kind of why I mentioned them.
yeah, this is a good topic. So I know you have a lot of divergent takes, and we both do, and so I'm interested to talk about this. Notice that yeah, like Zcash was the first implementation of a lot of ZK and a lot of like interesting new tech, and they've continued to create a lot of new tech, but they've not been able to build a strong enough community or network effect around the use of their currency. So while they're creating a lot of value, they're not necessarily accruing any of that to their token. They're just like a kind of like a nonprofit science lab. It feels like. What are your thoughts on Zcash in that regard, or in other projects that you see creating a lot of value but not accruing any of it to the token?
That's a tough one. Honestly, with Zcash particularly, I'm not that like well versed on it, but I could mention that like realistically with tokenomics, there's a few things to consider. You have to consider like what is the purpose of the token in the chain. And so with Zcash, it's very clear it's a form of money. So the token, the network effects of it really come down to how much of a strong belief system is in that token being money. And that comes from like, is it a unit of exchange? Is it a store of value? Is it used as collateral? And the answer to most of those is no, right? Like you don't use Zcash as a unit of exchange. Maybe you do for like privacy payments, but you don't use it for like um, to make transactions, right? You don't use it as a store of value, really. Like it's inferior in most ways to Bitcoin, or at least most people would think that. And then as a type of like currency, you definitely don't denominate things in Zcash, and you definitely don't use it as collateral. So like it doesn't meet those objectives well, and I guess that's part of the reason. And it feels like so. It's not that there's anything wrong with it. It's just that that is sort of like the issue of being of the token being money specifically. And when the token is money, it has to have money effect, like be used like money and have network effects of money. Otherwise, it won't live up to it, and it won't have it won't get the tokenomics, anything, the way you design system, it won't accrue value back to it because it just, there's no other means for it to. And so with ETH, you see it is sort of a money, it is sort of a currency, it's sort of a unit of account. It is definitely collateral. Um, it's a store of value. It's, it meets these properties. And then I guess the other thing comes down to is like, um, it, on top of that, it also has like this network effect of like the consensus there. So I feel like where Bitcoin has like obviously has it's very sound money, it's very sound it's a very sound store of value, but it's sort of like the tokenomics of it don't accrue any value to the token either. But the reason it works for Bitcoin and like and I love when people say like Bitcoin's a religion because it absolutely is. But like the reason it works for Bitcoin is because it sort of has there is a whole lot of consensus for it to be money, and like there is a big community that consider it money. It has like these money properties and it's accepted as store of value from people. And every time like some new big entity or rich person or country or whatever legitimizes it as in a store of value in any small little way, it sort of feeds the network effects of it like, twofold. And like, for example, like the ETF, right? That narrative is like so hot right now, even though I don't think the ETF is really that big of a deal. Although, like recently, I've been convinced otherwise based on like seeing what the gold chart looked like after an ETF. Although I'm not sure how related that, like how much you can overlap there would be there. But that's like the newest hot narrative, right? Like the ETF, it's sort of another layer of validation that this is a sort of a store of value and is legitimate. And I feel like, so for something like Zcash, it's lacking these things. And so it's very difficult. Now, for Bitcoin, it can get away with not having value accrual for those reasons. And the stronger that belief system is in it being that, the longer it could get away with it. So even if miners eventually aren't profitable really to run Bitcoin, and it's not that profitable, I mean, there's been greater absurdities that have been upheld, and over time for like long sustained periods, right? Like, namely through religions. So, like, if Bitcoin is a religion, then it could certainly, like, even if the security budget is flawed and like the tokenomics are flawed, it could certainly continue on indefinitely, in that fashion, right? And I think, like, if you just look at some religions, certainly there's aspects of some religions that don't that you that make anyone question it, except for like the really devout religious people. But like it's sort of there's a lot of angles of it where you would think how realistic is it, or like how like do I agree with this belief system or not? And I feel like Bitcoin is like the same thing, right? Like so what if like during certain periods like miners might not be profitable? Does that really affect the tokenomics like long term? Or is it more important for it just to be predictable in the fact that it exists and it doesn't change? And I feel like it's definitely the latter, right? Especially when it comes down to like the religion of Bitcoin and like and how it is. And I think somebody wrote a really good thread on a while ago on how Bitcoin is a religion and what it's viewed at, but he kind of wrote in a sort of a negative light and in a way that like Bitcoin is a religion and thus it's devolved as a tech stack. But I feel like that is I retweeted it and I sort of shared that I think it is a religion, but I look at it the opposite way, that it's very good and that it's sort of validation for the crypto, that it's like that it's a religion and that it is I don't know if it would devolve from a tech stack or evolved or whichever you want to call it, but I feel like it's definitely a good thing for it. And like just like this the inception story of it too, it just feeds into it really well. So yeah, I feel like Bitcoin's unique in that regard, that like they can have absolutely no other network effects than that and just exist and do well. But like when you go further down the line, like Zcash or even a Monero, that becomes much harder to sell. And so even though I feel like Monero like is in a lot of ways everything that Bitcoin kind of wanted to be, it's still not the it just can't live up to the same way it live up to it in the same way that Bitcoin has now. And it's going to be difficult for it to get there, or any other crypto to get there. The reason ETH is sort of there and competing is because it has this alternative sort of multi-use case on chain where it could do so much things. It can be collateral. It's a currency for like trade on digital assets. It's also paid for gas. You use it to pay for gas, and it has like these really strong network effects of how the value accrues to the network. And then now you add in proof of stake, which is like a secondary level of network effect for the token because it gives the token direct control over upgradability of the protocol. And so anyway, it just, ETH competes really highly on every level. And even still, you see it can't outperform Bitcoin in a lot of times, right? So it has all these network effects and all these tokenomics, but it still sometimes doesn't outperform Bitcoin. So I feel like it's very difficult for anything that's trying to be money to compete now in that realm. And I feel like Zcash falls in that category. And then like for when you see with DeFi apps,
This space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.
quite often they're trying to be like these governance tokens that just accrue value directly from the protocol in a more direct sort of way, which makes sense. And often you just see like people like not doing it because they cite regulatory reasons, but they have like a stronger sell really on terms of what value they can capture than like something like a Zcash even. So it's really difficult to solve the tokenomics problem. It just depends on what you're trying to do and what the project is. But anything trying to be money, it's just very difficult to compete now, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think about these various cryptocurrencies according to their use case, and so with Bitcoin, I think we share this viewpoint that Bitcoin is an exception to the rule of tokenomics and value accrual and things like that. And I think the poor tokenomics coming from DeFi protocols or other blockchains or mostly the app layer kinds of applications with tokens is founded on this idea that something can hold a speculative value like Bitcoin does, which in my opinion is misguided. And so the way that I would break down the use cases and the value of these currencies is, currencies are proportional, are valuable proportional to their use. And you can use, the GDP of an economy to approximate the value of its national currency. So Bitcoin, I think, is most likely headed towards Saifedean Ammous's Bitcoin standard. In my opinion, this is a terrible thing and a real failure of the Bitcoin community over the last decade to preserve its original intentions as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. But whole big blocker debate, I won't get into that. But Bitcoin, in my opinion, I think it could be the collateral for sovereign or state currencies, and then I see Ethereum as the front runner for the currency of the internet, not just because it's plugged into several dApps and the backbone of the kind of things that could catch hold in the around the world, but because it's just so useful, and it's the kind of thing that companies and people may be willing to hold a balance of. It would be an easy common denominator of exchange. And then Monero I see as the currency of the dark web, where Zcash is not used on the dark web at all. And there might be one small market that accepts it, but these are the places that I see those particular currencies being used.
Yeah, I like that the internet currency of the internet phrase. Like I say the same thing. I feel like ETH is definitely positioned well to be the currency of the internet, just because of the way like everything's set up right now. And like I said, it's gonna be difficult for anyone to crack into that area. I feel like interestingly, Bitcoin was the closest it was to being peer-to-peer cash in 2013 when local Bitcoins was still up and running and like properly, like the like meeting up in person, like that is as close you get to peer to peer as possible, right? Like you have literal physical like bartering between two parties, and using Bitcoin to make that transaction. Like that's about as close to peer peer as it was. But like I feel like just it sort of died down. I feel like it sort of broke down before even the block size debates. It was already breaking down because just like part of the reasons of like one of my first critiques of Bitcoin, the fact that you can't transact it trustlessly. So like there's no way to trade Bitcoin for anything else other than Bitcoin. So you have to do it physically, and because you have to do it physically, then you need a centralized exchange or you need to be in person. And as soon as I don't even know why, but the government cracked down on local peer-to-peer Bitcoin buying sign, which I can't believe people allowed that to happen, right? Like at that time, it wasn't big enough, right? I guess it just wasn't big enough. But essentially, they just they're banning people from trading currency locally peer-to-peer. I feel like that's I can't it doesn't make sense. But anyway, so realistically, I feel like that was the closest it got to being peer-to-peer cash, but it was then.
Yeah, I think we missed that opportunity um, to push that narrative. And what I've seen over the last 10 years is people diluting the values of crypto, which is why I focus so much on censorship resistance now, because people are like, well, it's it's publicly auditable, so you can verify that someone's doing something with corporate funds that that's above board, or like they're they're saying it's programmable money, and so you can do these novel things that you can't do in traditional finance. But both of those things are somewhat possible with other technologies. The only thing that is completely unique to blockchains and blockchain based applications is censorship resistance. And it's an emergent property that comes from decentralization, privacy, and financial incentives. And so I like to focus on that. And I noticed we have that in common. So, what are those? What are those things that you're seeing in regarding censorship resistance, whether it's like projects or narratives? Feel free to take this any direction you want, but I'd like to talk a bit about censorship resistance and how you think about that and how you see it in the space.
Yeah, I think when it comes to censorship resistance, it's an interesting topic because you need to consider like what the goals of a project is. I feel like the like crypto in general, the whole like philosophy of it is somewhat anti-establishment, right? So you have to have like some in order to really truly appreciate crypto, you have to at least have some critical view of certain existing institutions, existing processes, existing regulations, existing just like norms and customs. And I feel like it's at the heart of crypto. But what I do see happening recently is that is sort of getting abstracted away, especially with like the recent NFT crowd. They come to completely like forget and miss that whole part of it. And so I oftentimes also see like some of the criticisms of blockchain, like people that say, "Oh, crypto doesn't really do anything. Crypto doesn't solve anything," or like, "Oh, blockchains still don't have any real use case." It's almost always like 99% of the time. Maybe it's not actually 99% of the time, but it's like really high percentage of the time. These individuals are like very satisfied with the status quo of their institutions. So like they're okay with their banking services. Like they have no problem with it. They have no problem like with their brokerage account, right? Like they have no issues, trading their assets and their and financial instruments. They have access to, easy access to all this stuff, right? Like there's nothing that interesting about it. They have cash apps that they can send money from one person to another really easily. Or if you even think about really like older people, right? People who did banking like a long time ago or used to like, taking a booklet to the bank and having it stamped or whatever. Like to them, the value proposition of blockchain isn't that significant because what they have exists in like the existing banking that they have is just their existing services are like they meet their needs, right? They don't have any complaints really, unless they're from like a third world country or a place where they don't have access to like sound financial services, and they also don't have trust in like local governments or trust in like the country's monetary policy. And so for them it makes total sense, the value proposition of blockchains. And so like every time someone says oh, crypto still doesn't have a use case other than speculation and being casino, almost every time you can assume that that person is very content with like the current financial establishment, right? They might have some quarrels and might say it's a scam, but like overall they're fine with it, right? And like that's why they think that way. So like I think when it comes down to who really value censorship resistance, it's almost always the people who truly understand the value prop of blockchains and crypto. And so obviously it's like people in third world countries, people who are trying to build apps that are like outside of the influence of any one party. And like, realistically, it kind of the degree of censorship resistance depends on the situation. And I guess something like Bitcoin wants to have as much censorship resistance as possible because it's trying to be like this completely credible neutral store of value. Ethereum in the same sort of way. The only problems is that like the more functionality that any application is going to have, or any protocol, it's going to be more centralized just by design, because there's like more complex like tasks and functions that need to be fulfilled. So like, with ETH, there's like, there's so much more that you do on ETH. And then like, because of that, there's like these centralizing forces like MEV, because you could trade multiple tokens on ETH. There's a property of MEV. There's MEV in Bitcoin too, but it's just not as much to extract. So like, there's nothing that competitive. So it's not a strong centralizing force. And then on ETH, another centralizing force is like the Oracle providing the people who are bringing data on chain. And then another part of that is like there's people who are issuing stable coins on that chain, bringing value from off chain and issuing it on chain and allowing it to be redeemable off chain. So like these sort of interests create these centralizing forces, which are kind of unavoidable. And I feel like, so you need to really consider how much influence any one party might have, and how much censorship resistance is required to counterbalance that. So I feel like, as much as I am very critical of ETH, sometimes of the censorship resistance, and like, namely like the stablecoin influence on Ethereum, I feel like it's going in the right direction and it's getting better. I also am not that threatened by Lido, even though like people make a big deal out of it. Maybe we can talk about that after, but I'm not that threatened by Lido. I think realistically, when you look at miners like Bitcoin, it also has the same issue of like centralized miners, which are like these huge, like easily noticeable, essentially like data warehouses, right? Like massive factories, like mining farms that are just running like 24/7. Very easy to detect on your electrical grid. Very easy to like locate and like censor and shut down or whatever. So I feel like there are these same issues with Bitcoin as well. But the only difference is that in proof of stake, your validators have put up a stake, and if they do something wrong, like if they do fall into a position of power and they have like 51% of the network or whatever, they better behave themselves, because if they don't, they're at risk. Like their stake is up, right? They have a bond up, and if they misbehave, that's at risk. So like, I feel like that principle alone is just a deterring factor from anything too bad happening, from Lido being able to do anything too bad. Whereas with like proof of work, like there's no way to penalize someone who's attacking the network, constantly bringing new hash power on and trying to like build 51% hash power. Like you can't really stop them from continuing to do it without penalizing everyone else that's also participating. So it's like, so realistically, it's like I'm not that concerned, and I feel like ETH is moving in the right direction in general in terms of the degree of censorship resistance it needs. Now, ETH itself, I feel is moving in the right direction. Every other app on Ethereum, I'm a little bit questionable about. So I would like ETH, like it's like, I don't know if you want to stop there and we talk about some stuff, but yeah, I feel like I when we get to like I can draw the line at ETH and say that ETH is, in my opinion, has adequate amount of censorship resistance. But like anything past that on the application layer on Ethereum, I feel like it's questionable, depending on the situation.
Yeah, we did a whole space about Lido and the vampire attacks yesterday. I would encourage anyone listening to check that out. It was with Marco and Ether, who's from SSV Network and does tokenomics. He's a brilliant token economist. And he talks about the decentralizing and the centralizing forces, and he actually believes that the market forces are going to win out and keep Ethereum decentralized with respect to liquid staking. But I wanted to address an audience question that we had. So from Frisco, asking, censorship resistance is crucial to those of us who live in Africa, where governments are more tyrannical. how do we align such tools to build sustainable development, or censorship resistance? I guess, yeah. How do we align such tools to build sustainable development, or to develop sustainably? What do you think about that, Millie?
Yeah, so I think I feel like we're going in the right direction with most of it. Unfortunately, one of the issues we're seeing is that geopolitics is coming like rearing its head big time into crypto. And like when you're talking about geopolitics, you're talking about countries like not being friendly with each other, and as a result, like sometimes you get underdevelopment in certain areas of the world and with respect to a certain technology, and like that's also a centralizing force and like disruptive force to blockchains. And I feel like realistically, it's not an easy one to solve for, aside from sort of expanding the communities, like the social there, and sort of like collaborating outside of your immediate circles, trying to find people who are building in like in a different part of the world, and like sort of joining theirs communities. There's like a really bust DeFi builder community, Latin America. It's called DeFi Lat Am is their official it's sort of like their official community handle, and they're like really active, and they actually contribute to a lot of major DeFi protocols. But they're sort of like they're like completely independent of all the bureaucracies of like Silicon Valley and like all like the burger politics and like and some of the also completely independent of a lot of like the European sort of um, highly surveillance movement, and like this sort of like highly regulated movement of Europe. It's sort of like completely independent of all those like small little developer communities with who had like their own respective like customs or whatever. And it's actually really interesting one. I feel like they value censorship resistance a lot, just due to the nature of like where they live and the sort of the government they have to deal with. So yeah, I feel like that's an interesting community to maybe get in touch with, because I feel like they're building a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think censorship resistance, you hit on this earlier, but I see censorship resistant people, or people that are thinking about this, is in broadly one of two categories. The first is the divergent thinkers that understand that innovation comes from being different, and that being different can scare people and cause them to reject you, and so they want to ensure a you know a a place for themselves, like a haven, to still be able to transact financially and participate in global systems. And I think that's what Silicon Valley represented initially, was the divergent thinkers who all gathered together, built their own space, and then that got invaded by normies, and now is going to shit, quite literally. Um, and then the second category, though, is those who have experienced tyranny firsthand, and the what a lack of infrastructure does and looks like, and the destabilization that causes in a country. And those people are interested in creating tech that can't be turned off. And I think Africa broadly, many countries in Africa are great proving grounds for some of the concepts that we have, whether it's network states or decentralized finance or social coordination schemes of some kind that need to use a blockchain, DAOs in lieu of LLCs, or things like that. And so I hope and expect that we are going to see this kind of innovation take off in Africa. And I'm looking forward to that censorship resistant ethos being iterated on in those places. So thanks, Frisco, for that question. Millie, I wanted to ask you maybe about some of your hot takes in general. Like, what would you say? We've got 10 more minutes here. What are your hottest takes about in crypto and in crypto narratives? Like, which things do you think? What are your top 2 or 3 opinions that you feel like are most controversial?
Okay. Well, okay. One that I have that I sort of say jokingly is that I feel like too many builders are building with regulators in mind, and that doesn't make much sense in my opinion, because regulators are going to be always adverse to things that are new and they challenge sort of like the status quo. And like part of the crypto movement is sort of like anti-establishment. So you're supposed to build first and build it resiliently and sort of ethically from the get-go, and build it with ethics in mind and like what you're trying to solve, right? Rather than building with like the law in mind. So like if you imagine Satoshi, if Satoshi had built Bitcoin with like considering all the like whatever the law was at the time regarding these things, and like considering all that, it wouldn't have been a successful project, right? He built it with like strong, like sort of principled foundations in mind, and he built it based on that, and just put it out there. And so like realistically, I feel like anything that's sort of trying too hard to fall within like the existing framework is not going to work. So I feel like one of the things I say is that if your blockchain or your blockchain protocol or project isn't offending a law somewhere in the world, it's not doing its job. So if it is somewhere in the world where it's like at the simplest level, like in China, like there's capital controls, right? So if your blockchain doesn't allow you to circumvent those Chinese capital controls, it's not doing its job, right? So that's like one of my really really hot takes.
That is quite a hot take. I would summarize that as blockchains are useful for things that
Civil
governments
disobedience.
don't want to happen. Yeah, exactly. I completely agree with you, and I think that's why we resonate on censorship resistance. But I take it you don't think Craig Wright is Satoshi.
Definitely not. So yeah, definitely. You know what? I actually went down the Satoshi rabbit hole recently, and like I couldn't get any. I feel like it's too late now to find any compelling leads now. But I don't know. I'm completely lost on who it could be. But yeah, definitely not Craig Wright.
Well, that is quite a hot take, and I think that precludes real world assets from being useful. And and you've hinted at that a little bit. I want to jump and
One thing I
skip
should
over.
just clarify quickly though is that
Yeah,
by when I say that, I don't mean that like the blockchain is purposely supposed to like just be like a fuck you to the law. That's not the point. The point is that the the purpose of the chain is to be so neutral, right? And that it can't be influenced in these ways. And then the other main thing that I'm sort of taking a shot at is these DeFi apps that are just so worried about bringing value accrual to the token because they're scared it might make him more security property like. And I feel like that's just a load of like nonsense. Like just because the token accrues value doesn't mean that it's more security. Like most of the time, if they're going to consider the token as a security, it probably is a security regardless of if it has fees or not, because it controls the fees regardless. So like whether the fees go to the token or they go to some public good funding or whatever, like anyone reasonable understands that the token is controlling the fees. So like there is no the minor difference that the token accrues the fees, like that's just like now you're getting into super legalese territory where you're guaranteed like you're not building for ethical reasons, you're building for strictly like legal purposes, like to satisfy some law somewhere, right?
right.
And like when you're doing that, then you're obviously not building a sound system. And so that's where that's really where I was kind of going with that. So like when that's what I mean, like too many builders build with like regulation. Like we got to understand like these are like civil laws, right? Like securities laws, these are civil laws. Like when the SEC sues someone, it's a civil lawsuit, right? It's not like FBI getting involved in shit, unless like it's like securities fraud. But like in most of the cases, it's like a civil suit, right? So it's like a civil matter, and then you have these devs like who are very willing to build like protocols and create tokens that are like likely going to be worth billions of valuation, but they're just so scared of like potentially offending this one law, right? So I feel like anyway, I feel like sort of the incentives are screwed there because when you do a private raise as for a token, you have these parties that are really going to be pushing you towards taking the most sort of the most legally appropriate path, which might not be the most optimal path for the protocol, or or for like, or even make the protocol useful, right? Like it might make the protocol less useful, but because like these, in order for them to recoup their investment, that's probably the best way to go about it. Most projects do, and so like that's a whole rabbit hole of its own. Sorry to cut you off
Yeah,
there.
no, that's okay. To summarize your position, I think it sounds like you're saying that it's not that blockchains and their applications are intentionally trying to stick it to the man. It's that they're happening to upset people because they're disruptive to the status quo in some form.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Although I come from a very libertarian background, but so I tend to skew a little more that way. We have a couple questions here, a couple more questions. We've only got 5 minutes left, and I want to ask you this: how do you think about the trade-off between scalability and censorship resistance? This is an audience question again.
Oh man, so I feel like that question has been gone over, like smarter minds than me have gone over it a lot. So I'll just without paraphrasing too much of what has probably been said a lot in various papers and blog posts, but essentially the ultimate trade-off comes down to the fact that scaling more, it just means more computation. That's all it means, allowing computation to happen faster. And for multiple computers around the world to communicate faster, and also come into agreement on what they're communicating on, so that giving guarantees that every node or every computer that's performing this computation is performing it accurately, and they all come to agreement, all very quickly, is just physically difficult tasks to perform, right? So the physics of it are difficult. To have a computer in South Africa, a computer in North America, and a computer in Australia all come to consensus, right? And I'm obviously making it sound very simple. It's not one, it's thousands, right, of computers and scattered around the world, and they all have to come to agreement very quickly and perform a very complex computation or process, right? Whatever a node is doing, when you send a transaction to the chain. On Ethereum, it can't do that much, right? Ethereum is somewhat constrained, but on layer 2s, that computation is happening off chain and then getting posted on chain. And so the reason they're shortcutting is because they're doing that computation off chain. And so with Ethereum, if you're trying to get 1,000 nodes to do that same computation that the rollup is doing off chain and to come in agreement really quickly, it just, you don't have that guarantee that they can do it that quickly, with the same trust, with the same trust guarantees that Ethereum has at the moment, and with and while keeping the gas fees low, right? And so the issue that Solana faces here is that the fee to transact is not high, right? So there's not this spam resistance. So it's very cheap to spam the chain and to DDoS it, and to make all these computers around the world that are communicating with each other difficult to communicate in real time. And so the problem with censorship resistance comes down to this very issue: is how do you ensure that you could scale the system such that there's many nodes around the world, so that it is censorship resistant, so it's not just a few computers talking to each other. And then at the same time, you have to design it technically such that this computation can actually happen, right, without being too expensive, or not without it being cost prohibitive. And so balancing those two out, I'm sorry for not being the best at sort of describing it, but to balance these out is sort of, it comes down to the blockchain trilemma of how do you balance it for what you balance for. And basically it comes down to trade-offs where you can't have all three, and you can only really optimize for two and then have trade-offs for the other. So it really comes down to that, how much scalability is important. And I feel like Bitcoin maxis have already made their stance very clear that scaling, you don't necessarily need scaling at the base there, that it just needs to, you don't even need to scale. And then of course you have the other end of the spectrum who's to say that oh, if you cannot transact with each other with very low cost instantly, then it's not a real payment system, or blah blah blah. So it comes down to philosophy and trade-offs, really, and it's really difficult one to solve for. But I hope I kind of answered your question and was clear.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. And I'd definitely be interested to talk about that Solana bit another time. I think that would be a fun hot take to dive into. But we're at the end of the hour, and so I'm going to close out the space. But before we do, where can everybody find you, Millie? And what are you working on? Share some stuff for the audience that you'd like them to check out.
So right now I'm just contributing to synthetics. I sort of left a couple other initiatives and sort of just focusing here. And yeah, you can expect some interesting stuff coming from synthetics in the coming months, especially like with new deployments and stuff. So it's going to be really interesting. You might have already seen some chatter about synthetics like on Twitter due to this increased activity on the perps V2 on Optimism, but there's going to be a deployment coming on base shortly that will also be that is probably going to make a lot of headlines too. The interesting thing on base deployment is that it's obviously lower security assumptions on base, given that it's like Coinbase chain. So it actually allows the protocol to do a few cheats and like cut some corners and in terms of what sort of collateral we accept and like what stablecoins we accept on base, because it is like just a higher a less trustless environment. So yeah, so some of the things that we might not have been able to get away with synthetics community on ETH mainnet, because they're all like a lot of purists, we can get away with on base. So it's going to be an interesting little experiment sandbox, experimental grounds.
That sounds awesome. It sounds like there's a lot ahead for synthetics, and excited to hear that you're involved in that as well. We'll definitely have to talk more about this in the back channels or maybe in another space. But yeah, thanks for coming on today, man. It was really great talking with you, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of your hot takes and interesting tweets. So I'd recommend everyone follow Millie and keep up with him. He's doing great stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I had a great time. Thanks for letting me just rant my way on the space.
For sure. It's been a pleasure.
Have a great one, man.
You too. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Catch you all later.